I live in a small, forgotten village somewhere in the heart of Europe. The fields stretch endlessly, the houses are old and weathered, and life here moves at the pace of the seasons. To most of my neighbors, I am nothing more than an old man, thin, frail, with hollow eyes that sink deeper each year. My steps are slow, my back bent from the weight of time, and when I pass through the narrow streets, few bother to notice. They see me as the quiet recluse who keeps to himself. The children whisper that I am strange, that I sit for hours on the bench near the churchyard staring at nothing. The adults know little more. They nod politely but do not ask questions. They do not know, or perhaps they do not care, that my silence hides decades of memories too heavy to share. I have no medals to display on the walls, no proud tales told at the tavern. My name was never carved in stone nor written in books. History marched on and men like me faded into its shadows. But sometimes when the wind carries the distant echo of church bells, or when the smell of damp earth rises after the rain, I feel the past stirring within me. Images return of fire, of loss of youth wasted in the grip of a war that devoured everything. And so I begin, not for glory, not for recognition, but because the silence has grown unbearable. I walk through war, through blood and fire, and though the world has forgotten, I remember. I have lived through war, I whisper to myself, but no one remembers anymore. I was born in a small village in southern Poland, where the fields stretched to the horizon and the coal mines swallowed entire generations of men. My father was one of them, a miner whose lungs were blackened long before his body gave in. He would return home each evening, his face streaked with soot, hands trembling from exhaustion. My mother ran a small stall at the market selling bread, potatoes, and whatever vegetables we could grow in our patch of earth. It was never enough. Hunger was a familiar companion at our table. As a boy, I had little time for play. By the age of 10, I was already hauling water from the well, gathering wood in the forest, and helping neighbors harvest wheat. My hands blistered, my back ached, but I learned early that survival left no room for weakness. Yet there were moments that seemed almost sacred fragments of a life untouched by war. I remember the church bells of Sunday mornings echoing across the valley. The village festivals in summer, when we danced in the square under lantern-light music, lifting us above our struggles for a night. The golden sea of wheat swaying in the warm wind, promising bread for another winter. But poverty never let me forget itself. The injustice of it all burned inside me, how hard we worked, yet how little we had. That hunger for more than bread, for dignity and fairness, became a quiet fire within me. It was a fire that war in its brutal way would one day awaken. The Poland of my youth was a nation always bracing for storms. After the First World War, we had reclaimed our independence, but the years that followed were restless ones. The economy faltered, and in the mining villages like ours, men stood in long lines for work that never came. Political voices clashed in the streets, some calling for stronger ties with the West, others whispering of revolution. Poverty and uncertainty bred both anger and fear. By the mid-1000s, 932nd shadows were already gathering beyond our borders. To the west, Germany roared under Hitler's banners, promising to restore lost lands and glory. To the east, the Soviet Union loomed, its own ambitions no less dangerous. We villagers did not need newspapers to tell us that war was coming. We felt it in the air, in the sudden shortages at the market, in the way adults lowered their voices when speaking of politics. Propaganda seeped into every corner of life. Posters and loudspeakers spoke of duty sacrifice, the need to defend Poland at all costs. The army marched in parades through nearby towns, their boots striking the cobblestones in perfect rhythm. For boys like me, it stirred something between awe and dread. We knew sooner or later we would be called. In the evenings when neighbors gathered outside the church, after mass conversations always turned to the same questions. Should we prepare to fight or cling to peace? Could Poland survive if war truly came? Some said we must stay silent, keep our heads down. Others, mostly the young, whispered of resistance, of pride, of refusing to bow. I listened to all of it, my heart torn. I was still just a boy, but already I sensed that history was moving fast and that it would not spare us. I never dreamed of being a soldier. I was a miner's son, a village boy who wanted nothing more than a full belly for my family and a chance to live quietly. But the world rarely asks what we want. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, the air was torn by the sound of planes and the ground shook with artillery. Our village trembled under the boots of soldiers who spoke a language not our own. I saw neighbors dragged from their homes, their faces white with terror. I saw my father beaten for refusing to give up his tools, my mother clutching her shawl as if it could shield her from humiliation. Something inside me broke. Poverty had already planted in me a hunger for dignity, but occupation fed it with rage. I realized I could no longer stand by, no longer be just a bystander to cruelty. I am no hero, I told myself. But if I do nothing, then who will remember us at all? It was not courage that pushed me forward, but necessity, the desperate need to protect my family, my land, and whatever fragments of freedom remained. And so I stepped onto the path that would define my life, though it would cost me more than I could ever imagine. Looking back now, I see how naive I was. I thought joining the fight would be simple, that I could pick up a rifle, defend my home, and return once the danger had passed. But war is never simple. It devours years, lives, and souls, leaving behind only shadows. I remember the day I left clutching the small scarf my sister had pressed into my hand. My mother's tears stained my shirt, and my father's silence cut deeper than any farewell. I walked away believing I would come back quickly, stronger, perhaps even proud. Instead, I walked into a darkness I could not imagine. Fire, hunger, betrayal, and loss waited for me on that road. Friends would vanish in smoke, names would be buried in unmarked graves, and the boy who left the village would never truly return. I never thought I would become a man with a gun, I whispered to the shadows that follow me even now. But when war came to my door, I had no choice. And so began the journey that would define me, one of resistance, survival, and memories too heavy to be forgotten even when the world has chosen to forget. The day I left still lives in my memory, sharper than any other. It was early morning, the mist clinging to the fields like a shroud. The whole village seemed to be awake, though no one spoke above a whisper. Men my age, barely grown, were gathering near the church, some clutching bundles, others carrying nothing at all. The bells tolled as if for a funeral, their sound echoing down the narrow streets. My mother wept openly, pressing her face against my chest, as though she could hold me there, keep me from slipping away. Her tears soaked through my shirt. My father stood behind her silent, his weathered hands clenched into fists. He said nothing, but his eyes told me more than words could, pride and fear wrestling in silence. My younger sister pressed a small scarf into my hand, a scrap of fabric she had embroidered with clumsy stitches. "So, you don't forget us," she whispered. I tried to smile, tried to hide the storm of fear churning inside me. Around me, boys I had known all my life shifted nervously, their faces pale. Some made crude jokes to mask their dread, others stared at the ground. We were farmers' sons, miners' sons, and shopkeepers' sons, not warriors. Yet the war had chosen us. When the trucks arrived rumbling down the dirt road, the air grew heavier. Mothers clutched, their children, wives, kissed their husbands, and prayers rose in hurried whispers. I climbed onto the back of a lorry, the wood rough beneath my hands. As it lurched forward, I looked back at the village one last time. My mother was still standing in the road, her hands clasped as if in prayer. My father had put an arm around her shoulders, his face carved from stone. That was the moment I understood I was leaving behind, not just my family, but the boy I had been. Ahead lay something I could not yet imagine. Behind me, the sound of church bells faded into the distance, swallowed by the roar of engines and the first steps into war. The barracks were nothing like home. Rows of wooden bunks lined the drafty hall, the air thick with the smell of sweat, damp, straw, and fear. We were issued uniforms that hung loosely on our thin frames, boots that blistered our feet within hours, and rifles older than many of us. The officers barked orders in voices that brooked no hesitation. From the first moment, it was clear weakness would not be tolerated. Training began at dawn long before the sun crept over the horizon. We were marched for miles across frozen fields until our legs felt carved from stone. We dug trenches with numb hands, learned to crawl through mud, to fix bayonets, to fire and reload until our fingers blistered. Meals were thin bowls of watery soup, chunks of bread that vanished too quickly. Hunger followed us everywhere, gnawing more than the cold. At night, the barracks filled with coughing groans and whispered prayers. Some of the boys cried quietly into their blankets, muffling the sound so the sergeant would not hear. Others cursed under their breath, vowing they would desert at the first chance. For me, there was no thought of desertion, only the dull determination to endure. Yet even in that bleakness, something unexpected grew. Among us, bonds began to form. In the exhaustion of endless drills, we learned to share water, to lift each other when someone collapsed, to whisper encouragement when spirits broke. I met men I would later call brothers: Janik, a farmhand with hands like oak roots; Merrick, a wiry student whose glasses fogged in the cold; and Piotr, who carried a harmonica and played soft tunes that made the nights feel less cruel. Still, fear lingered. We knew the war was moving fast, swallowing cities and villages. Rumors swept through the camp of Warsaw. burning of armies collapsing before German tanks. We trained not with the certainty of victory, but with the desperate knowledge that soon we would be thrown into the storm. One night, lying awake, I listened to the distant rumble of artillery. It was faint yet undeniable. The war was no longer an idea. It was moving closer step by step until it would find us. I clutched my sister's scarf in the dark and wondered how much of the boy who left the village would remain by the time I returned, if I returned at all. Our first mission was supposed to be simple. That is what the officer told us, as if such a thing could exist in war. We were to move under cover of night and cut a railway line used by the Germans to move supplies. In and out, he said. Quick and clean. But nothing about that night was quick and nothing was clean. We moved through the forest in silence, our breath clouding in the cold air. Every sound seemed magnified, the snap of a twig, the scrape of a boot on frozen earth. My hands shook as I gripped the rifle, though I prayed no one noticed. I had never fired it outside of training. I had never pointed it at a man. When we reached the tracks, the demolition team hurried to place charges. The rest of us spread out rifles, raised hearts pounding. That was when the shouting began. A German patrol had stumbled upon us. In an instant, the night exploded. Gunfire cracked flares, lit the trees in harsh white light, and the forest seemed to shatter with chaos. I froze as a boy. I had trained beside Merrick, the one with the glasses, cried out and fell. His glasses shattered on the stones, reflecting the sudden burst of fire like broken stars. My ears rang, my chest heaved, and instinct screamed at me to run. Instead, I raised the rifle, aimed at a shadow, and pulled the trigger. The recoil jolted through me. I do not know if I hit a man or only darkness, but the shot changed something in me forever. The charges went off with a roar, tearing the tracks into twisted steel. Flames licked the sky. We scattered, fleeing back through the woods, chased by bullets that snapped through branches and tore at the earth near our feet. I remember stumbling, gasping, feeling the scarf in my pocket as if it were the last tether to sanity. By dawn, we were back at camp, bruised, bloodied, fewer than when we had left. Marek's bunk was empty, his harmonica still lying under his pillow. I stared at it for a long time, realizing for the first time what war truly meant. It was not glory. It was not honor. It was the sound of a friend's last cry, the weight of a rifle in trembling hands, and the knowledge that nothing would ever be the same. After that night in the forest, I carried Marek's harmonica in my pack, though I never touched it. It rattled softly against my rifle when I marched, a reminder of how quickly laughter could vanish. To survive, I began to write letters to my family, scratched on scraps of paper when the camp was quiet. Dearest mother, I wrote, though my words were lies. I told her that I was well, that the food was enough, that I had friends who watched over me. I wrote of the training drills, of the cold mornings, of the pride I felt serving Poland. I never told her about the way Marek's cries still echoed in my ears, or how I woke at night with my hands shaking. Some truths were too heavy to send home. When replies came, they were worn from the journey edges, smudged with fingerprints. My sister's letters were the lightest, filled with stories of the village. She told me how the wheat was growing tall, how the church bells rang on Sundays, how she still wore the ribbon I had given her years ago. Her words painted pictures of a world untouched by war, a world I could step into for a few minutes each time I unfolded her letter. Sometimes I closed my eyes and let the memories flood back, the smell of bread baking in the kitchen, the warmth of our small hearth, the laughter of my sister chasing geese in the yard. I clung to these images as if they were shields. Without them, I feared I would forget who I was. One evening, as artillery rumbled faintly on the horizon, Janik, my comrade with hands like oak roots, sat beside me. He caught me reading my sister's letter for the 10th time. Does it help? He asked quietly. I nodded, though my throat tightened. He smiled and said, Then keep it close. The war will try to take everything from us. Don't let it take that. I folded the letter carefully, tucking it beside the scarf in my pocket. In that moment, I understood these words, these scraps of memory were more than paper. They were lifelines. They reminded me that beyond the mud, the fear, and the gunfire, there was still something worth surviving for. By the autumn of 1939, the Poland I had known was gone. The German invasion had swept through our defenses with tanks and planes that crushed everything in their path. Warsaw burned for weeks, its streets echoing with the thunder of artillery, until the city finally surrendered. We heard rumors of bombed churches of children buried beneath rubble of executions in the squares. To the east, the Soviets marched in, carving our country in two. Poland had been betrayed by geography, caught between two giants who cared nothing for our survival. For us in the camps and scattered units, the war no longer followed the lines of maps. It lived in whispers and shadows. The government had fled into exile, the army shattered, but among the ruins, something else began to grow resistance. Radios hidden beneath floorboards caught faint broadcasts from London urging Poles to fight on. In villages, clandestine presses printed leaflets, their ink still wet, as they passed from hand to trembling hand. Even in our barracks, we felt the shift. Official orders spoke of regrouping, but in reality we were learning to become something else. Fighters without uniforms, soldiers without an army. We dug caches in the forest, stashed weapons beneath barns, and memorized routes through fields that could carry us unseen. The enemy occupied our towns, but the land still belonged to us, and we would use it like a weapon. At night, huddled around a candle, we spoke in hushed tones of Warsaw's defiance of villages that had risen in revolt of heroes, whose names were already legends, though they lived only a few valleys away. Fear was constant, but so was resolve. We may be broken, Janek said one evening, but we are not finished. I clung to those words. The war was no longer a distant storm. It was everywhere in the ruined cities, in the eyes of children who no longer played, in the silence of families missing fathers and brothers. And it was in me too. I knew then that I was no longer just a soldier. I was part of something larger, something hidden, something that refused to die. It was in the winter of 1940 that I was called upon for my first true mission with the underground. Until then, I had carried messages, hidden weapons, or watched from the shadows. But this time, we were tasked with striking directly at the Germans, an ambush on a convoy carrying fuel and ammunition through the forest outside Krakow. For days, we prepared in silence. We studied maps, walked the terrain under the cover of darkness, and dug shallow trenches along the road. Every detail mattered. A careless word, a misplaced boot print could mean death for all of us. I remember the faces of the men around me, Jonik, steady as stone. Pyotr restless but brave. And Stefan, the one who always made us laugh, though his eyes betrayed his fear. None of us had been trained for this. We were farmers, miners, and students transformed into shadows by necessity. The night of the ambush was bitterly cold. We lay in the snow, our breath rising like smoke. The forest was eerily silent, the only sound the creak of ice beneath our bodies. My heart pounded so loudly I feared the Germans would hear it. Then, faint at first, came the rumble of engines, the convoy. The trucks appeared, headlights slicing through the dark. We waited until the first vehicle reached the bend in the road where the trees pressed closest. Then Janet gave the signal. The charges we had planted erupted in fire and thunder, tearing the road apart. The convoy lurched wheels, shattering men, shouting in confusion. Gunfire followed, sharp and deafening. I squeezed the trigger again and again, my hands trembling, the recoil slamming into my shoulder. I saw shadows falling, men clutching at wounds, flames climbing into the night sky. One truck exploded in a roar that lit the forest, sending shards of metal whistling through the trees. But amid the chaos, there was no triumph, only terror. I saw Stefan stagger, his laughter silenced by the red stain spreading across his chest. He fell without a word. The sight carved into me deeper than any bullet could. Within minutes, it was over. The convoy was destroyed, the survivors scattered. We fled back into the woods, carrying the wounded, leaving behind the dead. Snow swallowed our tracks, but it could not bury what we had seen. When dawn came, I sat by a frozen stream, the scarf my sister had given me clutched in my fist. My body shook not from the cold, but from the knowledge that I had crossed a line. I was no longer just resisting. I had killed, and I had watched friends die. War had stripped away the last illusions of glory. All that remained was survival and the haunting knowledge that every victory carried a price written in blood. We buried Stefan in a clearing, deep in the forest, far from the road where he fell. There was no priest, no hymns, no proper coffin, only a shallow grave dug into the frozen earth and the trembling hands of men who could not speak. Snow fell softly, covering our tracks, muffling our grief. We could not linger. The Germans would come searching, and we had to vanish like ghosts. Janik whispered a prayer as we lowered Stefan into the ground, his voice breaking on the words. Pyotr placed a harmonica Stefan had once borrowed into the grave, muttering, "So you can keep playing wherever you've gone." I stood silent, unable to form a single word. My throat was dry, my chest hollow. The scarf in my pocket felt heavier than iron. I had thought I understood fear, but grief was something else entirely. It was sharp, merciless, and it left no place to hide. Stefan had been full of life, always joking, always lifting our spirits when despair threatened to crush us. Now the forest had swallowed him, and the world carried on as if he had never existed. That night, as we huddled in a barn miles away, I found myself staring at the rafters, replaying the moment he fell. I could see the flash of gunfire, the way his body crumpled, the sudden silence where laughter had once been. I asked myself over and over, could I have saved him? If I had shouted louder, fired faster, moved quicker, would he still be alive? The truth was unbearable. In war, death was not always the punishment of mistakes. Sometimes it was simply chance, cruel, and blind. Yet that truth offered no comfort. Pyotr broke the silence. "We can't let it be for nothing," he said, his voice ragged. "Every bullet we fire, every bridge we burn, it has to mean something." For him, Janik nodded, but his eyes were wet. None of us truly believed we could balance the scales. Still, we clung to the thought, because without it, we would lose ourselves. In the days that followed, I noticed a change in me. The boy who had left the village, the boy who trembled at his first shot, was gone. In his place was someone colder, harder. I began to see the world not in shades of hope, but in survival and loss. Stefan's laughter still echoed in my ears, but now it was a ghost, a reminder of what war steals and never returns. We left no marker on his grave, no stone to bear his name. The forest alone remembered where he lay. And I swore as long as I lived, I would carry his memory because the world would not. It happened on a night that seemed like any other. I had been sent as a courier carrying a packet of coded messages from one cell of the resistance to another. The snow was falling heavily, muffling my footsteps, and I believed it would cover my trail. But the Germans were waiting. Perhaps someone had betrayed us, or perhaps it was simply bad luck. Either way, the moment the dogs began barking, I knew my life had changed. They dragged me from the ditch where I tried to hide my face, pressed into the ice, my arms twisted behind my back. The butt of a rifle struck the side of my head, and the world blurred into black and red. When I woke, I was in a truck bound with ropes surrounded by others whose eyes were wide with terror. No one spoke. We did not need to. We all knew where we were going. The prison camp was a place where hope went to die. Barbed wire crowned the fences, watchtowers loomed over the yard, and guards patrolled with rifles always at the ready. They stripped us of our names, calling us only by numbers. We slept on wooden planks crowded with vermin, our breath visible in the freezing air. Hunger gnawed constantly. The soup was little more than warm water, the bread so thin it disappeared in 2 bites. Punishment was swift and merciless. A man caught stealing an extra crust was beaten until he could no longer stand. Another accused of sabotage was hanged in the yard as we were forced to watch. The guards wanted us to understand our lives were theirs to break. Yet, even in that hell, there were sparks of defiance. An older prisoner, Tomasz, whispered stories of Poland's kings and uprisings, his voice trembling but fierce. "They cannot take this," he said, tapping his temple. "Our memories are the last weapon." Another man smuggled scraps of pencil and paper writing down names of the dead so they would not vanish into silence. At night, I lay awake staring at the shadows cast by the searchlights, wondering if I would ever leave. Fear gnawed at me, but so did guilt. Had I carried the scarf too openly, had my hesitation led them to me, I replayed every step, every decision, as if answers could undo the chains around my wrists. But in time, something shifted. The Germans could starve us, beat us, strip us of dignity, but they could not erase what burned inside me, the memory of my sister's letters, my mother's tears, Stefan's laughter. These were the fragments of freedom that survived behind the wire. And I clung to them with a desperation sharper than hunger, because without them, I knew I would not endure another dawn. The chance came when no one expected it. After months in the camp, days blurred into one another, roll calls, forced labor, beatings, hunger. Hope was a fragile thing, easily crushed. Yet one night in the dead of winter, a guard grew careless. The storm outside was fierce, the wind howling against the barbed wire. Visibility was poor. And in that chaos, an opportunity appeared. Tomasz, the older prisoner who had kept our spirits alive with stories whispered of a plan. For weeks, a few men had been loosening the planks in one of the storage sheds near the fence. It was madness, we all knew, but madness was better than waiting to starve or be shot. That night, as the snow fell thick and heavy, we made our move. My heart pounded so loudly I feared it would draw fire from the watchtowers. Crawling on frozen ground, we slipped behind the shed. The planks gave way, revealing a narrow passage dug by desperate hands. One by one, we squeezed through the earth, pressing against our ribs, until at last the cold night air hit us like a slap. The fence loomed ahead, its barbed wire glistening with frost. A gap had been cut, small, dangerous, but just enough. We slid through, tearing our clothes and skin. My scarf caught for a moment, and I almost cried out in despair, but Janik, who had been captured weeks after me and thrown into the same camp, yanked me free. Blood streaked my arm, but I didn't feel it. All I felt was the snow under my boots and the sudden vastness of freedom. We ran. The forest swallowed us branches, clawing at our faces, lungs burning with each breath. Behind us, shouts erupted. Gunfire cracked through the night. Bullets tore into the trees, splinters flying like sparks. We did not stop. We could not stop. The storm became our ally, covering our tracks, drowning the noise of our flight. Hours later, when our bodies could carry us no further, we collapsed in the hollow of a frozen creek. I pressed my face into the snow, gasping, listening. Silence. Only the wind and the frantic beat of my own heart. For days we stumbled through the countryside, guided by nothing but instinct and desperation. Villagers risked their lives to shelter us, offering bread, a blanket, or simply silence. Each act of kindness was a miracle. When we finally reached a safe house linked to the resistance, I nearly wept from exhaustion. I was no longer the same man who had entered the camp. I had walked through hell and crawled back out, scarred and hollow but alive. Freedom did not feel like triumph. It felt like a reprieve, fragile and uncertain. That night, lying on a straw mattress, I realized something. I was not just fighting for survival anymore. I was fighting to ensure that the memory of those who had died in the camp, Stefan Marek and so many others, would not vanish into silence. Their voices now lived in me and I carried them forward. Freedom did not bring relief. It brought a weight I had never known before. When I first joined the resistance, I thought of honor, of defending my country, of being part of something larger than myself. But after the ambushes, the graves in the forest, and the hell of the prison camp, those words rang hollow. I carried ghosts now. Stefan's laughter, Marek's broken glasses, the faces of nameless men who fell beside me, all of them followed wherever I went. At night, their voices filled my dreams, calling out, asking why I lived when they did not. I had no answer. Even when I rejoined the resistance, the fire inside me had changed. I no longer fought out of pride or hope of victory. I fought because I had no other choice. I fought because the dead deserved to be remembered, because their sacrifices had to mean something, even if the world would never know their names. There were moments when I looked into the eyes of German soldiers before pulling the trigger, and I felt a sickness rise within me. They were young, many, no older than me, caught in the same machine of war. For a fleeting instant, I wondered if their mothers had pressed scarves into their hands, if their sisters had written letters filled with longing and hope. The thought haunted me, but it did not stop me. War had no room for mercy. Survival demanded hardness even when it corroded the soul. I realized then that I would never return to the boy who had left the village with trembling hands. He was gone, buried in the snow alongside Stefan and Marek. What remained was someone else, a man forged by hunger, fear, and grief. A man who understood that survival was not the same as living. One night as I sat by a small fire with Janek, he asked me, "What will you do when this is over?" I stared into the flames, unable to answer. What future could there be after all this? The war had stolen my past, my youth, my innocence. It had carved me into something unrecognizable. But in that silence, I understood one thing. My purpose was no longer to dream of a future. It was to carry the memories, to ensure they did not vanish into the dark. The Germans could take our homes, our lives, even our names, but they could not erase our stories if someone kept them alive. And so I resolved that if I survived, I would become a witness. Not for glory, not for recognition, but so the world would know that we had lived, fought, and died. That we were not shadows, but men. When I finally found my way back to the resistance, months had passed since my escape from the camp. The safe house smelled of damp straw and smoke, and when I stepped through the door, silence fell. Faces turned toward me, faces I once knew, though they had changed. Janek was there, older, somehow, though only a year had gone by. His shoulders were heavier, his eyes darker. He embraced me tightly as if afraid I might vanish again. Others clasped my hand, but behind their relief was something else, a quiet sorrow. Too many were missing, too many bunks lay empty. The unit I returned to was not the one I had left. Marek was gone, Stefan was gone, and dozens more, whose names I once called during roll call, were now buried in shallow graves across the countryside. The laughter that used to echo in stolen moments had vanished, replaced by silence and weariness. We had become men carved from stone, shaped by hunger, fear, and grief. Even as they welcomed me back, I felt like a stranger among them. I had survived the camp, but survival had marked me. My body was thinner, my face hollow, my eyes carrying shadows they did not share. When they spoke of plans, ambushes, supply raids, coded messages, I nodded, but part of me stood apart as though I were watching from behind glass. At night, lying on the cold floor beside my comrades, I struggled to rejoin the rhythm of their lives. Their jokes sounded brittle, their silence heavier than before. I envied their ability to laugh even weakly, while my own lips could not form the shape of joy. Yet, beneath the weight of grief, there was still duty. We were fewer, but we were not finished. Each of us carried ghosts, and those ghosts demanded we fight on. The resistance was no longer about victory, not in the grand sense. It was about endurance, about refusing to vanish quietly into the dark. Janik said to me one night, his voice rough with exhaustion, "You came back from the dead brother. That means you have to keep going for all of us who can't." I nodded, though my chest ached. With the truth I dared not speak. I had returned, yes, but the boy who once dreamed of glory was long gone. In his place stood a man who fought not for triumph, but simply to ensure the fallen would not be forgotten. It was in the spring of 1943 that the order came, a coordinated strike against a German supply depot on the outskirts of Krakow. Unlike the small raids and ambushes we had grown used to, this was something larger, riskier, a blow meant to echo beyond the forest. If we succeeded, the Germans would feel it. If we failed, the resistance would bleed more than it could afford. The plan was simple in theory. Under the cover of night, we would infiltrate the depot, plant explosives, and withdraw before dawn. But in war, simplicity never lasts. Every step was shadowed by fear, fear of betrayal, fear of discovery, fear of leaving yet another friend behind in the dirt. As we crept through the darkness, the air smelled of oil and iron. The depot loomed ahead, lit by floodlights, guarded by soldiers whose boots clicked against the pavement. My heart hammered as we crawled under the wire fence, the scarf from my sister pressed against my chest like a talisman. The explosives were placed with trembling hands. Janik's face glistened with sweat, though the night was cold. Each minute stretched into eternity. Then came the first shout. A guard had spotted movement. Bullets cracked through the silent sparks, leaping as they struck the metal drums around us. Chaos erupted. We fought our way out, firing blindly, dragging the wounded behind us. The charges detonated moments later, a roar that split the sky and turned the depot into a storm of flame. The shockwave threw me to the ground, ears ringing, eyes blinded by fire. Through the smoke I saw shadows collapsing, some German, some our own. We escaped, but not whole. Several comrades never returned. Their names were whispered as we regrouped in the forest, their absence as heavy as the ash that clung to our clothes. That night, I sat apart from the others, staring at the glow of the burning depot on the horizon. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt hollow. Each explosion seemed to echo with the voices of those who would never see the dawn. War was no longer a struggle for glory. It had become a cycle of fire and loss where every triumph demanded a payment in blood. And though I still carried a rifle, I began to wonder whether survival meant more than victory itself. The bullet tore through my side during a skirmish near the Vistula River. It was not the grand battle we imagined in our youth, but a sudden clash, an ambush gone wrong, a hail of gunfire in the dark. I felt the impact like a hammer, the breath driven from my lungs, and for a moment I thought death had found me. Janik and another comrade dragged me into the forest, my boots leaving a trail of blood in the snow. Each step was agony fire burning through my ribs. We hid in a peasant's barn, the air thick with hay and fear, while a young woman pressed rags to my wound. There were no doctors, no morphine, only whispered prayers and the grit of clenched teeth. Fever came quickly, twisting the world into shadows. I drifted in and out of consciousness, hearing voices that weren't there, my mother's lullabies, Stefan's laughter, Merrick calling my name. For days I lingered between life and death. When I finally woke, fully weak but alive, I realized something had changed. My body would never be the same. The wound healed, crooked each breath, a reminder of my fragility. I could no longer run as before, no longer carry the same weight on my back. The war had branded me permanently. But the deeper wound was inside. Nights were the worst. I woke, drenched in sweat heart, racing the echo of gunfire still in my ears. In dreams I saw the camp's barbed wire, the hollow eyes of prisoners, the faces of comrades buried in shallow graves. I tried to pray, but the words felt hollow. I tried to laugh, but my chest clenched with guilt. The others told me I was lucky. You survived, they said. That's all that matters. But I began to wonder if survival was a blessing or a curse. To survive was to carry the memories of those who did not, to wake each day knowing I had lived while better men had fallen. The scarf in my pocket, once a token of hope, now felt like an anchor dragging me into the depths of grief. I realized then that the war was not only fought in forests and fields, it was fought in our minds in the silent hours of the night where no comrades could come to our rescue. And it was a battle I feared I was slowly losing. After my wound, I could no longer fight as I once did. Each march left me gasping, each skirmish threatened to tear open the scar along my ribs. Still, I refused to lay down my rifle. To leave the resistance felt like betrayal of Stefan Marek and all the others whose blood had soaked the soil. Yet I knew deep inside that if I stayed on the front line much longer, my body would betray me before my will ever did. The debate raged within me night after night. When I looked into the eyes of my comrades, I saw exhaustion, but also fire, the same fire that had carried us through hunger and loss. How could I walk away from them? And yet when I woke screaming from nightmares, when my chest burned after a short run, I realized the truth. I was already half broken. One evening, as we huddled in a cellar lit by a single candle, Janik placed a hand on my shoulder. "You've given enough," he said quietly. "We need men who can carry guns, yes, but we also need those who can carry memories. If we all die, who will tell the world what happened here?" His words struck deeper than any bullet. Could survival itself be a form of resistance? Could choosing to live to bear witness be as valuable as dying with a rifle in my hands? The thought unsettled me, yet it also gave me clarity. The next morning, I laid my weapon on the table. My hand trembled not from weakness, but from the enormity of the choice. I would no longer lead raids or ambush convoys. Instead, I would serve differently, helping with messages, hiding fugitives, recording names and stories, ensuring that the truth would not vanish into silence. It felt like surrender, and yet strangely like defiance. The Germans could take my strength, they could scar my body, but they could not erase what I had seen, nor the stories of those who had fallen. I swore that I would keep their voices alive even if mine was the last left to speak. That night, as I tucked my sister's scarf under my head like a pillow, I felt the faintest trace of peace. For the first time in years, I believed I might survive, not just as a soldier, but as a witness. Stepping away from the rifle was not the end of my war. It was simply the beginning of a different battle. I carried messages across ruined villages, hid fugitives in cellars, and scribbled names of the fallen on scraps of paper to preserve them from oblivion. Each act felt small, almost invisible, yet I began to understand their weight. Bullets could wound the body, but memory could defy time itself. In those quiet tasks, I grew in ways the battlefield never allowed. I no longer measured courage by how many Germans I could kill, but by how much truth I could keep alive. The fire inside me shifted from rage to responsibility, from vengeance to remembrance. I realized I was not just fighting for freedom in the present, I was fighting for the right of future generations to know what had happened in those years of shadows. War had stripped me of youth, laughter, and innocence, but it had given me clarity. I saw now that victory was not certain, nor was survival. But dignity could be preserved if someone remembered. That burden fell upon me, and I accepted it with the gravity of a vow. One night, as the resistance gathered in a ruined barn, Janik asked each of us why we continued to fight. Some said for Poland, some for revenge, some simply because there was no other choice. When it was my turn, I answered, for the ones who cannot speak anymore, for their names, their stories, so they are not erased. Silence followed, then nods. In that moment, I felt no shame for having stepped back from the front line. My role was different, but no less necessary. I had entered the war as a frightened village boy, trembling at the sound of his first shot. I had been hardened into a soldier, broken into a prisoner, and scarred into a survivor. Now at last I had become something else, a witness. And with that realization came my turning point. I no longer sought glory, nor even victory. I sought only to carry the truth forward, even if the weight crushed me. Because if the world one day forgot us, then all our suffering would have been for nothing. When the war finally ended, it did not come with a single moment of triumph, but with a slow unraveling of terror. The Germans, once so certain of their dominion, began to retreat. Their banners were torn down, their patrols vanished from the roads, and for the first time in years, the sky seemed less heavy. Word spread quickly, liberation had come. In Krakow, I watched as crowds filled the streets, people weeping, embracing, waving flags that had been hidden for so long. Church bells rang out their sound, no longer muted by fear, but alive with joy. Children laughed, racing through the rubble as if the ruins themselves were playgrounds. For them, the war was over. But for me, the victory felt hollow. I stood among the celebrating throng, yet I could not lift my voice to join them. My eyes searched the faces, but Stefan was not there. Marek was not there. Too many were missing their laughter, replaced by silence, their bodies buried in unmarked graves across forests and fields. I felt only emptiness, a strange ache that no flag could heal, no anthem could drown. Liberation had come for the country, yes, but not for us who carried the war inside. As fireworks lit the night sky, I turned away. The people saw freedom as a beginning. For me, it was only an ending, an end carved out of blood and ashes, an end that came too late for those who should have lived to see it. When I finally returned to my village, it was not the place I had left behind. The fields were scarred, many houses stood in ruins, their windows shattered like blind eyes staring into nothing. The church still stood, but its bell tower leaned cracked by years of neglect and shell fire. Silence hung in the air where once there had been laughter and song. My mother was waiting, though she was not the same. Her hair had turned white, her body stooped with age and worry. When she saw me, she clutched my face in her trembling hands, tears running freely, whispering my name as though saying it might keep me from vanishing again. My sister, no longer a child, stood beside her, a young woman, now hardened by years of survival. She embraced me fiercely, though there was a strangeness in her eyes, as if she embraced a ghost. Neighbors came and went, offering cautious smiles, but many of the faces I remembered were gone. Some had died in raids, others taken away, never to return. The village had endured, but it was not whole, just as I was not whole. I should have felt joy at being home, but instead I felt distance. The war had carved a chasm between the boy who left and the man who returned. And though I walked the same streets, breathed the same air, I realized that the village I longed for no longer existed, perhaps it never would again. The war did not leave me when the guns fell silent. It lived inside me, etched into my flesh and carved into my thoughts. My body carried its marks, the twisted scar along my ribs that ached with every breath, the limp in my step when the cold set in the nights, when coughing racked me until dawn. I was alive, yes, but never whole. Worse than the wounds were the shadows in my mind. I woke from sleep, drenched in sweat, heart pounding, as if the camp guards still shouted outside my cell. In dreams, I saw Stefan falling Marek's broken glasses glittering on the stones, the faceless dead who had passed through my hands. By day, I tried to live as others did, walking the streets, nodding to neighbors, pretending that peace had truly returned. But behind my eyes, the war played on a reel that never stopped. Sometimes, laughter in the square made me flinch, as though joy itself were foreign. At other times, the silence of the countryside pressed so heavily on me that I longed for the noise of gunfire just to feel less alone. Survival had come at a cost. I had walked out of the war, but the war had not walked out of me. I was never a hero in the eyes of history. My name was not written in the papers, no medals pinned to my chest, no speeches given in my honor. When people spoke of the war, they mentioned great battles, generals, treaties, but never the faces of the nameless boys who bled in the snow. We faded into silence as though we had never lived at all. And yet I believed my purpose was not to win glory, but to remember. I carried the names of the fallen in my heart, whispered them to myself so they would not vanish. Marek, Stefan, Tomasz, Janek, each one a voice, a life, a story. I have written them down scratched in journals and hidden in boxes, because memory is the only monument we could afford. If one day the world listens, I want them to know war is not a tale of triumph, but of ordinary people crushed by forces beyond their control. It is mothers clutching scarves, sisters waiting for letters that never come, boys turned into shadows before their time. My testimony is not polished or grand, but it is real. I survived to carry it. And if my voice reaches beyond these walls, let it say this: we lived, we fought, we suffered, and we deserve to be remembered. Now I am an old man sitting on a weathered bench at the edge of the village. Children run past me, their laughter bright and unburdened, unaware of the ghosts that walk beside me. To them, I am only a frail figure, with hollow eyes, a relic of another time. They do not know the weight I carry, and perhaps it is better that way. The sun sets over the fields, painting the sky in red and gold. I watch it in silence, feeling the years press against my chest. The world has moved on. New wars have come, new names carved into stone, while ours fade like dust in the wind. But in my heart, the memories remain unchanged, unyielding. I whisper them into the dusk as if the dying light might carry them beyond me. Stefan, Marek, Janek, all the brothers I left behind. I have lived through war, I murmur the words trembling on my lips. I have carried its ghosts. And though the world forgets, I remember. And in that remembering, I know that we are not truly lost.